Is that what I think it is? My father's voice cut through the clinking of silverware and the hum of self-congratulation that always filled our family dinners. Forks hovered midair. My cousin's chatter about Ferrari's penthouses and designer handbags faltered into silence. Every pair of eyes swung toward me. He wasn't looking at my face. His gaze was fixed on my wrist. The antique watch, half hidden beneath the cuff of my blouse, gleamed faintly under the chandelier's cold light. I felt my stomach tighten. The room moments ago, alive with laughter and condescension, now held its breath. "May I see it?" he asked, his tone low but insistent. "Blake!" My cousin smirked in confusion. He had just mocked me for arriving by Uber, his voice dripping with pity, disguised as humor. Now, suddenly, his triumph evaporated as he noticed where my father's attention lay. I extended my arm slowly, the gold warm against my skin. My father leaned in his normally composed features, betraying something close to awe. "This is a Gerald Klein original," he murmured, as though naming a relic long thought lost. Gasps erupted around the table. My Aunt Pamela nearly choked on her wine. Madison dropped her fork with a clatter. Even Uncle Richard's perpetually smug expression faltered. Blake's eyes widened. He opened his mouth, but no words came. I looked at my father. Thomas Hayes, real estate tycoon, master of composure, and for the first time in my life, I saw him unsettled, stunned, maybe even impressed. And in that moment, I knew nothing about this dinner would be ordinary. Just hours earlier, I had debated whether to even wear the watch. Gerald's watch. The only gift he'd ever insisted I keep a piece of his soul he passed to me on my 27th birthday. Not because it was worth millions, though. Clearly it was. But because he told me it would remind me of my worth when the world tried to diminish it. Still, I hesitated. I knew what this dinner meant. The Hayes family's annual autumn gathering was less about gratitude and more about theater, a stage for wealth achievements and subtle power plays. Every laugh too loud, every story rehearsed, every compliment carrying an edge. I wasn't eager to step into that spotlight. I never was. But as I stood in front of the mirror that afternoon, pulling on my dark jeans and white blouse, Gerald's words echoed in my memory. "True wealth is invisible, Angelica. The moment you feel the need to prove it is the moment you've forgotten what it truly means." I fastened the watch around my wrist. Not as armor, but as a reminder that I wasn't walking into that dinner defenseless. The Uber driver had whistled when we pulled past the iron gates of my parents' Connecticut estate. Blake's Ferrari, angled like a showroom display, was the first car in view. Next to it, Uncle Richard's Bentley, my cousin Amber's Range Rover, and a gleaming parade of European imports lined the driveway like soldiers. My modest Camry Uber looked like it had taken a wrong turn. I tipped generously, thanked the driver, and stepped out. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the window above a silhouette watching. I didn't need a name to know it was Blake, already preparing his commentary. The door opened before I could knock. Miss Angelica Santos, the butler, who'd worked for my parents since my childhood, greeted me warmly. His lined face softened. "Welcome home." His words tugged at me more than I expected. Home. Did this mansion still count as that? "Thank you, Santos," I said, smiling. "How's Diego College treating him well?" His eyes lit up. "Yes. He speaks of you often. Your help with his essays. He said it changed everything." That warmed me far more than my cousin's flashy cars ever could. Inside, the marble floors gleamed. The chandelier glittered, and the air was thick with perfume, expensive cologne, and something more suffocating expectation. My mother spotted me first. Eleanor Hayes, flawless in her navy dress, her posture rigid with the confidence of old money. She kissed both my cheeks, then pulled back to scan my outfit. "You could have worn the Chanel dress I sent you for your birthday," she said with a faint sigh. "This is more comfortable," I replied, hugging her properly. "At least it's silk," she conceded, guiding me toward the grand salon. "Come, your cousin Blake just closed a major account." Of course he had. Blake's victories always arrived prepackaged for announcement. My father, on the other hand, met me with warmth. His hug smelled of the same cologne from my childhood. "There's my girl," he said. And then quieter. "Your latest quarterly filing." Impressive. That contract with Johnson and Williams a coup. I blinked. "You saw that?" He smiled faintly. "I keep tabs, even if you think I don't." He squeezed my shoulder. "Proud of you." The words meant more than I wanted to admit, but before I could reply, Uncle Richard swooped in, glass in hand, laughter a little too loud. "Angelica, we thought you'd forgotten us successful folks." I matched his smile, though mine was thinner. Good to see you too, Uncle Richard. The night unfolded as predictably as ever. Blake basked in his promotion to junior partner. Amber bragged about her Capri Villa. Madison flaunted her diamond necklace. Every story was a display case, every laugh a currency. I stayed quiet, letting them measure themselves in cars and handbags. Gerald's watch ticked softly at my wrist. But Blake couldn't leave it alone. "So, Angelica," he said, swirling his Bordeaux as the main course arrived. "Still working out of that co-working space downtown?" "No," I replied calmly. "We moved to our own offices last year. Flatiron." His brows rose. "Must be expensive. And how many employees now?" "Still just you and those 2 programmers." "We've grown a bit," I said simply. He exchanged a look with his father. "Well, startups are always a gamble. 90% fail in the first year. But hey, the fact you've lasted this long is impressive." Patronizing applause in disguise, and then with a smirk sharpened like a knife. "Oh, and I noticed you came by Uber. Still taking the bus, too." The table chuckled, polite but pointed. I felt heat rise in my chest. My mother's lips tightened. Aunt Pamela offered me pity in her eyes. But then the unexpected. My father set down his fork, his gaze locked on my wrist. "Is that what I think it is?" And just like that, the performance ended. The actors froze. The stage went silent. All because of Gerald's watch. The silence stretched. The chandelier hummed faintly above us. Every eye drilled into me, waiting. I could almost hear Gerald's voice in my mind. "Promise me you'll wear it when you need to remember your worth, not what others think it's worth." I straightened my shoulders, slid my sleeve back, and offered my father my wrist. His hands trembled. As he examined the timepiece, his voice hushed. Extraordinary craftsmanship. There were only 50 ever made, most in museums. "How did you come to possess this?" Blake's smirk had vanished. Aunt Pamela's wineglass tilted dangerously in her grip. And me, I sat there calm, steady, knowing that for the first time in years, I held the room. This, I said, my voice even, was Gerald Klein's gift to me, my mentor, my friend, the man who believed in me when no one else did. My father looked up at me, and in his eyes, pride and respect flickered like a flame newly lit. The room had shifted, the hierarchy had fractured, and the night had only just begun. Growing up as the daughter of Thomas and Eleanor Hayes meant marble staircases, boarding schools with century-old reputations and family vacations, where roughing it meant a villa in Capri instead of the Hamptons. On the surface, my life was flawless. Beneath it, there were cracks only I could feel. My father was the self-made one, the son of a hardware store owner who turned a modest inheritance into a real estate empire. He respected work sacrifice numbers on a spreadsheet more than labels on a handbag. My mother was the opposite, raised in a family whose last name adorned libraries and concert halls. She carried the weight of old money like a crown. Their worlds collided in me, and they never stopped fighting over which half of me should win. From the start, I was told what success looked like. Ivy League education, 6-figure salary straight out of graduation, then marry someone with the right last name. My cousins absorbed that doctrine without question. Blake in particular wore it like skin. He strutted through life as though the hierarchy of cars, homes, and job titles had been carved into stone tablets and handed directly to him. Me, I wanted something else. At Harvard Business School, while my classmates polished resumes for hedge funds, I sat in the back of lectures, sketching ideas for startups no one took seriously. I remember the night I told my family I'd turned down a cushy offer at my father's firm. The dinner table went quiet, then erupted. "You could be running development projects within a year," my mother cried, her fork clattering against fine china. "You'd have a Porsche by Christmas," Blake smirked, swirling his wine. I smiled calm. "I'd rather make coffee for a startup that excites me than drive a Porsche doing something I don't care about." "You'll regret it," Aunt Pamela warned, as though delivering a prophecy. I didn't. The startup was chaos incarnate. Half our computers barely worked. Our office was a converted warehouse where the heat cut out every other day. The team was young, brilliant, and broke. We survived on ramen Red Bull and blind faith, and I loved every second of it. That's where Gerald entered my life. He was brought in as a consultant during our lowest point. Investors were circling jaws open, ready to swallow us whole. Morale was at rock bottom. Then Gerald walked in, a man in his mid-60s with steel gray hair, a frayed sweater, and sneakers that looked older than some of our interns. I expected the usual consultant spiel buzzwords: impossible goals, empty confidence. Instead, he sat in silence through an entire meeting, then asked a single question. One question that cut through weeks of noise. "What problem are you actually solving?" The room froze. Nobody had an answer, not a real one. That was Gerald's gift. He stripped ideas bare until only the truth remained. Afterward, he found me in the hallway leaning against a vending machine that had eaten my last dollar. "You asked the right questions in there," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "Not many people do." We went for coffee. 3 hours later, he'd offered to mentor me. No contracts, no promises, just a quiet, steady belief that I had something worth sharpening. Gerald became the father figure I hadn't realized I was missing. My dad had given me ambition, but Gerald gave me philosophy. "True wealth is invisible," he told me once as we walked the streets of Palo Alto. "If you need to show it, you don't really understand it." He lived by that creed. Despite having founded 3 unicorn companies, he drove a 10-year-old Toyota and lived in a modest home lined with secondhand bookshelves. The only indulgence he ever admitted to was watchmaking, a hobby from his youth that had accidentally made his early fortune. He showed me one of his watches once. It wasn't flashy, the kind of piece that whispered rather than screamed. I stared at it like it was art. He smiled. "This taught me more about patience than business school ever did. Precision, restraint, discipline. That's real wealth." 2 years later, after our startup was acquired for hundreds of millions, Gerald stood by me as I founded my own company, Klein Dynamics, named for him, though he protested. "It should be your name," he argued. "It already is," I said. "You built me as much as I built this." He chuckled, but I saw the pride in his eyes. The early days of Klein Dynamics nearly broke me. I worked 18-hour days, slept on the office floor, and lived in a shoebox apartment with a leaky radiator. Investors wavered. My mother cried, calling me weekly to beg me to give up. Blake joked about when I'd come crawling back to the family firm. But Gerald was my anchor. When I doubted myself, he showed up with greasy takeout and war stories about his own failures. When I wanted to quit, he told me about the time his first company nearly imploded before turning into a billion-dollar success. And then on my 27th birthday, he gave me the watch. It wasn't wrapped. He just placed the box in my hands, eyes serious. "This has been with me through 3 companies, 2 market crashes, and 1 very public humiliation," he said. "Now it should be with you." "Gerald, I can't." "You can," he interrupted, fastening it around my wrist. "This isn't about its value. It's about what it represents. Promise me you'll wear it when you forget who you are." 3 months later, he died of a heart attack. I remember sitting in my apartment, staring at the watch ticking softly against my skin and realizing I'd lost more than a mentor. I'd lost the only person who truly saw me, not for my potential, not for my family name, but for who I already was. Since that day, I've worn it almost daily, not as jewelry, as a compass. And it was that compass I carried back into my parents' mansion years later, the night Blake mocked me for taking an Uber, and my father's voice broke the air with a single question. "Is that what I think it is?" If only he knew what it really meant. The months after Gerald's funeral felt like walking through fog. His absence was everywhere, in the silence of my phone, in the missing presence across the table at late-night strategy sessions, in the gnawing doubt I had no one left to lean on. But grief has a way of forcing decisions. I could either shrink back, fall into the life my family always wanted for me, safe, predictable, shallow, or I could honor Gerald's faith in me and build something worthy of his legacy. So I chose the harder path. Klein Dynamics was born in a rented loft space above a shuttered bookstore downtown. My office chair was salvaged from a thrift shop. My conference table was an old door balanced on filing cabinets. But the dream was intact, a platform that could give small businesses the same analytical power as corporate giants. The early years were brutal. I bled money, time, and sleep. There were nights when the radiator clanged so loudly in my apartment that I sat awake at 3 a.m., crunching numbers, wondering if my stubbornness had finally crossed into self-destruction. Yet every setback carried Gerald's voice with it: patience, precision, discipline. Clients trickled in one pizza shop at a time, one corner grocery, one mom-and-pop bookstore. They couldn't pay much, but their survival felt like mine too. When one bakery owner cried in gratitude after our tools saved her from bankruptcy, I thought, this is why I'm here. But none of this mattered at family dinners. To them, I was the cautionary tale, the cousin who threw away opportunity. Blake made it his personal pastime to remind me how easily he'd climbed the ladder at his father's firm. Amber paraded her European vacations like war medals. Madison posted her every new handbag online as though it were a career milestone. I stayed silent. I let them laugh. Because what would be the point of telling them my startup had doubled revenue for 3 consecutive quarters? or that we'd just been invited to present to Fortune 500 executives. They wouldn't have believed me. Or worse, they would have believed me for the wrong reasons. I learned to hold my cards close. Even my parents remained in the dark. My father, though, more observant than he let on, rarely pressed. He checked quarterly filings quietly, his pride flickering in small comments I wasn't supposed to notice. My mother, meanwhile, oscillated between disappointment and pity, her eyes always searching for some sign that I'd come to my senses. It was easier to keep my victories private, easier to let them think I was managing, while they compared car notes and mortgages. After all, what was the alternative? To walk in and declare myself a billionaire on paper, then watch their smiles rearrange into greed, envy, and false praise. I couldn't stomach the thought. So I kept building. By my 29th birthday, Klein Dynamics had expanded to a proper office in the Flatiron district. Glass walls, minimalist furniture, a floor buzzing with engineers, and designers who believed in what we were doing. I walked through those hallways each morning with a mix of pride and disbelief. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were growing, fast. A contract with a healthcare system brought in our first seven-figure deal, soon after government agencies came knocking. That's when I realized Gerald's philosophy wasn't just about humility, it was strategy. While others chased headlines, we chased results. Quietly, efficiently, invisibly. And invisibility became my shield. My apartment remained the same one-bedroom walk-up. I still took the subway most days, still wore the same jeans and plain blouses my mother sighed at, still blended into the crowd, even as venture capital firms offered me tens of millions in funding. There's a kind of freedom in anonymity. To sit on a train beside strangers who don't know you've just signed a $200 million contract. To buy a coffee without anyone caring that your name is trending in trade publications. But that freedom has a price. It meant walking into family gatherings as the odd cousin, the one who didn't measure up. It meant watching Blake bask in applause while I swallowed the urge to correct his every patronizing jab. It meant sitting through Eleanor's gentle scolds about stability, Pamela's pitying hand on mine, Richard's smirks about little ventures. And every time I told myself, let them think it. Better their contempt than their false respect. Still, some nights I caught myself longing. Not for their praise, God, no, but for something simpler. For my father to look at me the way he looked at Blake. For my mother to introduce me without that lilt of apology in her voice. For one family dinner where I wasn't the invisible woman at the table. It was weakness, I knew. Gerald would have told me recognition was cheap, but grief makes fools of us all. The invitations for this year's Hayes dinner arrived the same as always. Thick cream envelopes embossed with the family crest, as though we were some ancient aristocracy rather than a clan of competitive New Yorkers. I turned it over in my hands, debating whether to attend. Every year I considered skipping. Every year I told myself I didn't need the charade, and yet every year I went. Why? Because despite everything, a part of me still wanted to be seen. That night, as I dressed in front of the mirror, the watch sat on my dresser. The faint tick was a metronome to my thoughts. I touched the cool metal, remembering Gerald's words. Wear it when you forget your worth. Was I forgetting, or was I about to be forced to remember? I slipped it onto my wrist. When the Uber pulled into the driveway flanked by Bentleys and Ferraris, I saw Blake's silhouette at the window smirking already. He thought the battle had been won before I even walked in the door. But the watch ticked steadily, as if it knew what was coming. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this year's dinner would not end the way any of us expected. The Uber rolled to a stop in front of the Hayes estate, its headlights sweeping across the familiar limestone facade. The mansion rose out of the autumn dusk like a monument, proud, cold, and unchanging. I stepped out, the crisp air biting against my cheeks, and for a moment it felt like I was a teenager again, returning from boarding school to a home that never quite fit. Blake's Ferrari gleamed in the circular drive, angled deliberately so every guest would be forced to admire it. Next to it, Richard's Bentley sat like a loyal soldier, flanked by Amber's pearl-white Range Rover. I counted 3 Porsches, 2 Maseratis, and a Rolls-Royce I didn't recognize. The driveway was less a parking area and more a competition arena. My Uber Camry pulled away, leaving me alone in the glow of the estate's lanterns. I straightened my shoulders. Gerald's watch, pressing a steady rhythm into my wrist. Patience, precision, discipline. The front doors opened before I could even touch the bell. Santos, our butler, stood there, his face breaking into a genuine smile. "Miss Angelica," he said warmly, "welcome home." His use of the word struck me again. Home. Could a place that measured your worth in square footage and brand labels truly be called that? Thank you, Santos, I said, squeezing his arm. How's Maria and Diego? His eyes lit up. Diego started college this fall, first in the family. He talks about you often. Your help with his essays gave him courage. That warmed me more than the mansion's chandeliers ever could. Inside, the house smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume. The marble floors gleamed, the grand staircase curved upward like an invitation to another world. From the salon ahead, laughter and clinking glasses spilled through the air, underpinned by the discreet strains of a string quartet. I stepped into the lion's den. My mother spotted me instantly. Eleanor Hayes was impossible to miss. Tall, elegant, her silver-streaked hair swept into a chignon that belonged on the cover of Town and Country. She broke off from her conversation with Aunt Pamela, her designer dress shimmering under the light. "Darling," she said, kissing both my cheeks before pulling back to inspect me. Her eyes flicked over my blouse and jeans. "You could have worn the Chanel dress I sent for your birthday. It would have been perfect tonight." "This is more comfortable," I replied, hugging her properly. "At least it's silk," she said, softening her sigh into a smile. "Come, your cousin Blake has just closed a major account. Everyone's talking about it." Of course they were. Blake's victories were always trumpeted from the rooftops. Mine better left in silence, or so the family believed. My father was near the fireplace in conversation with Richard. He broke away the moment he saw me, his face easing into warmth that felt startling against the chill of the room. "There's my girl," Thomas Hayes said, pulling me into a proper embrace. He still smelled faintly of cedar and the cologne I'd associated with comfort since childhood. "How was the drive?" he asked. "No traffic, smooth." He studied me a moment longer than usual. "You look tired. Working too hard." "Probably," I admitted with a small smile, "but things are going well." He lowered his voice a rare conspiratorial tone. "That contract with Johnson & Williams impressive. I saw the filing." Surprise flickered through me. You read that?" "I keep tabs," he said simply, "and I'm proud." Before I could reply, Richard swept in, his cocktail glass clinking. "Angelica, we thought you'd forgotten us successful folks." His laugh was too sharp, his smile too forced. "Good to see you, Uncle Richard," I replied evenly. Behind him, Blake appeared, tailored suit, hugging his gym-trained frame, his diamond-encrusted watch glinting like a weapon. He leaned in for an air kiss, his voice dripping with mockery. "Cousin Angelica, loved the simple look. Very authentic." I gave him a nod. "Congratulations on junior partner. That's quite an achievement." He straightened, his tie smirk already forming. "Thanks. The Ferrari outside is my gift to myself. 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. "Impressive," I said, though my tone was flat. Gerald's watch pressed against my skin, steady as my heartbeat. Amber swooped in, next all champagne perfume and over-enthusiastic hugs. "Angelica, oh my God, it's been forever. I love what you've done with your hair. So natural." She barely paused for breath before launching into tales of Capri villas and infinity pools. Her words flowed like champagne, bubbly, intoxicating, but ultimately empty. Over her shoulder, I caught Madison showing off her new Rolex to her brother Justin, who scrolled lazily through photos of his Maldives trip. Aunt Pamela waxed poetic about the difficulty of sourcing Italian marble for her Hamptons kitchen remodel. The room was a symphony of acquisition. Each voice, another instrument in a performance about who had spent the most, traveled the farthest, flaunted the hardest. I stood in the center of it, Gerald's voice echoing in my memory. "True wealth is invisible." Invisible. Exactly what I had been in this family for years. A staff member announced dinner, and we filed into the dining room. The table gleamed with crystal silver and china place cards dictating our roles like casting notes in a play. Predictably, I was sandwiched between Blake and Madison, the two who enjoyed needling me most. As scallops were served and wine poured, the show began. Accomplishments were unveiled like centerpieces, each relative waiting their turn to bask in the glow. Madison touched her necklace, a diamond pendant catching the candlelight. Thomas surprised me after he closed the Peterson merger, 12 carats custom designed. "How thoughtful," my mother murmured, perfectly timed. Richard chimed in about an acquisition in Chicago, singing Blake's praises as if he'd single-handedly carried the firm on his back. Blake, feigning modesty, said, "Just doing my job." His smirk suggested otherwise. "And Justin, dear," my mother asked sweetly, "how's Goldman?" Justin straightened. "Rewarding. We just closed a $4 billion deal with a Saudi group. I'll be flying to Riyadh next month on the company jet. Nods and murmurs of approval circled the table. The air thickened with status. I ate quietly, answering only when directly addressed my gaze, steady, my words measured. Yet beneath the calm, a low current of tension pulsed. Blake's glances in my direction sharpened each time the spotlight shifted away from him. He was waiting, baiting, and I knew his strike was coming. Dessert plates clinked, conversation swelled, and then it came. So Angelica, Blake said, casually swirling his Bordeaux. How's the entrepreneurial life treating you, still working out of that co-working space? We moved into our own offices last year, I replied. Tone light. Oh, Flatiron District. Must be expensive. And how many employees now? Still just you and those two programmers. We've grown, I said simply. He exchanged a glance with Richard, lips curving into a smirk. Well, startups are always a gamble. 90% fail in the first year. The fact you've lasted this long is actually impressive. Polite chuckles rippled around the table, layered with pity. And then twisting the knife, I noticed you came by Uber. Still taking the bus around the city, too. The room stilled, tension rising like steam. My mother's lips pressed thin. Aunt Pamela's eyes softened in feigned concern. I opened my mouth to respond, and then my father's voice sliced through the room. Is that what I think it is? Forks froze midair. Conversations died. Every gaze shifted to me, to the watch. And just like that, the game had changed. The clatter of silverware died instantly. Conversations that moments ago buzzed like bees and champagne flutes fell silent. My father's words had frozen the room. He was still staring at my wrist. Is that what I think it is? I glanced down at the watch, Gerald's watch, its understated face glowing faintly in the chandelier's light. All evening it had been just a secret between me and memory. Now it was center stage. What do you mean? I asked carefully, though. My voice betrayed nothing. The watch, he said, his fork laid neatly across his plate, as if this discovery was far more important than food. May I see it? My cousins leaned forward like spectators at an arena. Blake, confused, tried to salvage his mockery. Really, Uncle Thomas, it's just a plain old watch. Angelica probably got it at some vintage flea market, but my father's tone sharpened. Blake, be quiet. The command sliced through Blake's smirk. He sat back, cheeks coloring. I extended my wrist across the table. My father's hands that had signed billion-dollar property deals and pointed out flaws in construction blueprints, now trembled as they lifted my arm, gently, reverently. He tilted the watch, studying the craftsmanship. This is a Gerald Klein original, he breathed. Gasps rippled around the table. Aunt Pamela clutched her pearls as though she'd been robbed. Madison dropped her phone onto her plate with a clatter of silver against porcelain. Even Uncle Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with sudden interest. Blake blinked. Wait. The Gerald Klein, the tech guy. Before tech, he was a horologist, my father explained, his voice low, almost reverent. He made 50 of these by hand. Every collector in the world has been chasing them for years. Most are locked in vaults or museums. His eyes lifted to mine. How did you come to possess this? The room leaned in as one. For a heartbeat, I thought of Gerald's voice, warm and amused. Promise me you'll wear it when you forget who you are. I didn't buy it, I said simply. He gave it to me. A silence thicker than velvet fell. Richard was the first to break it, his skepticism sharp. Gave it to you, Gerald Klein. Why would a man like that give you something so priceless? Because he was my mentor, I replied. My friend. He believed in me when no one else did. A murmur rustled across the table. I could feel eyes shifting, calculating, reevaluating. Blake's jaw tightened, his earlier smugness draining away like wine from a broken glass. My father released my wrist slowly, his gaze still locked on the watch, as though it were a holy relic. Do you know what this is worth? I nodded. I know, but that's not why I wear it. His eyes softened, pride flickering where skepticism usually lived. Across the table, Amber leaned in her champagne glass, trembling slightly. Worth what exactly? At least $2 million, my father said. Likely more given Klein's death. It's not just rare, it's history. Pamela coughed into her napkin. Madison gaped. Blake's Ferrari suddenly seemed like a toy in comparison. I let the silence stretch, then offered a shrug. Gerald told me beautiful things should be worn, not locked away. For the first time that night, the balance of power tipped. Dinner resumed, but nothing was the same. Where earlier I had been invisible now, every comment turned back to me. So Angelica Madison asked too sweetly, how did you meet Gerald again? At Innovate Tech, I said, carefully sipping my water. He was brought in as an advisor during a rough quarter. Blake's brows furrowed. Wait, that tiny startup that almost went under before Google bought it. You were there. Yes. Gerald noticed me, offered to mentor me. Later, he became my first investor. The table stilled again. Aunt Pamela's hand fluttered toward her pearls once more. Richard's eyes sharpened, less skepticism now, more calculation. How much did he invest? Richard asked casually, though his grip on his glass was tight. Enough, I said lightly. He believed in me. Blake scoffed, but it lacked conviction. Still an eccentric billionaire giving away watches. Sounds like sentimentality. Or foresight, my father countered. His gaze fixed on me. Gerald didn't give these lightly. That was when I felt it, something I had never truly seen in his eyes before. Not fatherly indulgence, not weary tolerance, respect. And it rattled me more than Blake's sneers ever had. The courses rolled on, but the mood had shifted. Amber chattered about her villa, but her voice lacked conviction. Justin attempted to drop a new deal into conversation, but no one listened. Eyes kept drifting back to my wrist to me. Blake tried again, desperate to reclaim ground. So what exactly is your little company doing now, Angelica? Still catering to mom and pop shops seems limited. I met his gaze steady. We've grown. Substantially. How substantially? Richard pressed. I paused Gerald's words, humming in my mind. Strategic transparency. Angelica, share enough to be respected, not enough to be exploited. So I gave them a morsel. We just finalized a federal contract. Largest deal to date. My mother blinked. Federal as in government. Yes. Blake leaned forward, his smirk faltering. How large? 900 million over 5 years, I said, my voice calm, even as gasps erupted around me. Pamela's wine nearly toppled. Madison's eyes bulged. Richard dropped his fork. My father's expression didn't change, but the pride in his eyes burned brighter. Blake sat back pale, his diamond watch suddenly cheap. For the first time, silence served me. As dessert arrived, the questions multiplied. Some laced with awe, others with greed. Why didn't you ever say anything? Amber asked, genuinely baffled. If I had that kind of success, I'd make sure the world knew. Because true success isn't about who knows, I replied evenly. It's about what you build. My father nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Gerald Klein's philosophy. Yes, I said softly. And mine. For the first time in years, the table looked at me not as an outcast, not as the eccentric cousin, but as something else entirely. And in Blake's eyes, I saw it most clearly, not admiration, not pride, but fear. Because the hierarchy he'd built his identity on had just been shattered by the quiet tick of a watch. The air in the dining room felt different after my father's declaration. The watch ticked softly on my wrist, yet its presence roared louder than any Ferrari parked outside. The chatter that followed wasn't casual anymore. It was deliberate, pointed every word a fishing hook cast my way. Uncle Richard leaned forward, the gleam in his eyes unmistakable. 900 million. Over 5 years. That's quite a figure. Which agency, if I may ask? Commerce, I replied lightly, cutting into my dessert. Operational analytics. The answer was deliberately vague enough to satisfy without surrendering too much. Gerald's voice echoed in my mind. Never give them the whole map, Angelica. Just enough for them to know you're not lost. Richard nodded slowly, though I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head. Already he was calculating ways to tie me into his world of acquisitions and portfolios. Blake, however, wasn't ready to surrender. His smirk returned, though it faltered at the edges. Government contracts are fickle. Politics, budget cuts, endless red tape. Sounds risky. Every worthwhile venture is, I said evenly. Across the table, Madison leaned in her phone, abandoned for once. But your valuation. How high is it now? Valuation. Amber echoed, eyes glittering. Wait, Angelica, are you saying you're like a billionaire? The word hung in the air like smoke. I didn't flinch. On paper, perhaps. But most of my wealth is tied to the company. I take a reasonable salary. Amber gaped. If I had that kind of money, everyone would know. I'd be in Paris, Milan yachts every summer. Which is why you'll never have it. Blake cut in sharply, though his eyes never left me. I studied him. Success isn't defined by what you spend, Blake. Gerald taught me that. His nostrils flared, the mention of Gerald stinging like salt in a wound. My father cleared his throat, his voice breaking the tension. Angelica's approach reminds me of Gerald himself. He kept his lifestyle modest, even when his wealth eclipsed most of his peers. Uncle Richard scoffed. Yes, but there's modest, and then there's impractical. A woman in her position living in a shoebox apartment taking the bus. Surely that's beneath her. I met his gaze calmly. My apartment is close to the office. I like walking to the coffee shop on the corner, and public transportation is efficient, better for the environment. Gerald took the bus every day until the day he died. Richard frowned, clearly unsettled by an ethos that couldn't be leveraged. My mother, though, couldn't hold her tongue. But darling, she said, her voice strained, you could live in comfort. You should surround yourself with beauty. That's what wealth is for. I smiled gently. I am surrounded by beauty, Mom. It just looks different than what you expect. Her lips pressed together as though she'd bitten into something sour. Blake seized the pause like a predator, spotting weakness. So, your company, what exactly does it do? You keep saying analytics, but that could mean anything. I set down my fork deliberately, feeling the weight of the room shift again. Every pair of eyes was on me. The family, once so certain of my insignificance, now waited like students before a teacher. We build algorithms that help businesses operate more efficiently, I explained. Predictive modeling, resource allocation, market analysis. We started with small businesses because they were ignored. Now, Fortune 500 companies use our platform. Hospitals, government agencies, anyone who wants to do more with less. Blake's jaw tightened. He wanted to dismiss me, but there was no easy angle. Richard leaned forward, hungry. And what's your market share potential? Have you considered merging with a firm that could give you scale? The offer behind his words was obvious. I smiled without warmth. Control is non-negotiable. Gerald's only condition was that I never surrender that. My father's eyes flickered with something I rarely saw in him: admiration. The room buzzed again, but the tone had changed. No longer mockery, now curiosity, greed, envy. Amber whispered to Madison, who was already typing furiously into her phone, no doubt, Googling Klein Dynamics valuation. Pamela leaned across the table, her voice syrupy. Darling, you should really consider sharing your story more widely. Think of the investors who would love to support a female entrepreneur. I'm not looking for investors, I interrupted gently. We already have more offers than we need. Pamela blinked, her mouth snapping shut. Blake, desperate, pushed again. But surely with valuations that high, you'll go public soon. Cash out while the market's good. I tilted my head. Not everything is about cashing out. The silence that followed was sharp. Blake looked around, waiting for support, but even Richard was quiet now, calculating. It was my father who broke the tension once more, his voice calm but carrying weight. Angelica has built something real, something lasting. Gerald saw it. Now the rest of us do too. And just like that, the tables turned fully. The remainder of the meal passed in a strange rhythm. Cousins who had ignored me for years suddenly asked polite, probing questions. Aunts offered patronizing smiles tinged with new respect. Amber wanted to know if I could recommend an app developer for her fashion startup idea. Justin suggested his firm might synergize with mine. I answered each question with grace, but little substance, revealing nothing more than I chose. All the while, Gerald's watch ticked steady and sure, reminding me why I was here, not to impress them, not to convert them, but to stand my ground without apology. Yet beneath the shifting dynamics, I felt something darker. Richard's calculating stares lingered too long. Blake's forced smile stretched thin. My mother's discomfort curdled into something close to panic, as though the daughter she thought she knew had become a stranger. And my father kept watching me with an expression I had never seen before. Pride, yes, but also regret, perhaps even guilt. It struck me then, the watch hadn't just changed the conversation. It had changed the balance of our entire family. And not everyone would forgive me for it. Dessert sat untouched in front of me, a delicate creme brulee that looked like perfection under candlelight. No one tasted theirs. All eyes were on me. Madison had abandoned subtlety, her phone angled under the table, fingers flying. A moment later, she gasped loud enough to silence the room. Klein Dynamics, she announced, scrolling furiously. That's your company, isn't it? It says here you're valued at $1.8 billion. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Amber nearly dropped her spoon. Pamela coughed into her napkin. Even Richard's carefully composed face cracked, his eyes widening before narrowing into something sharper interest laced with hunger. Blake's diamond watch flashed as his hands tightened around his glass. That can't be right, he muttered. It's accurate, I said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. For years, I had been the invisible cousin, the one mocked for her jeans, her bus rides, her little startup. And now in one sentence, the hierarchy of this family had shattered like crystal under pressure. You're, Amber stammered, eyes wide. You're a billionaire. On paper, I clarified. Most of it is tied to the company. I live comfortably, but not extravagantly. Not extravagantly, she repeated, incredulous. You could own penthouses in 3 cities, yachts, villas, and you live in a one-bedroom apartment. I smiled faintly. Happiness isn't measured in square footage. Her face twisted as though I'd spoken a foreign language. Blake found his voice, though it trembled at the edges. So all this time, you let us believe you were barely scraping by. I never corrected you, I said simply. Why his voice cracked, no longer condescending, but raw? Why keep it a secret? I held his gaze, because I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what I own. A ripple passed through the table, discomfort, awe, even shame. Richard leaned forward, his tone silk over steel. But surely, Angelica, now that the truth is out, you'll reconsider. A company of that scale, partnerships, mergers, expansions, you can't do it alone. I'm not alone, I said firmly. I have a team. And Gerald's advice. Advice won't scale you to the next level, he pressed. Capital connections, this family could. This family, I interrupted, my voice steady. This family mocked me for years, belittled me, assumed failure. Now that you see numbers, you want to help. Forgive me if I find the timing suspect. Richard's jaw tightened. For the first time all evening, he had no retort. Pamela jumped in quickly, her tone syrupy. Darling, don't take it that way. We only worried. We wanted you safe, secure. Safe, I echoed. Or compliant. There's a difference. Her cheeks flushed, and she busied herself with her glass. Across from me, my mother shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor's eyes, usually cool and composed, darted between me and the watch. She looked lost. For decades, she had measured success in gowns and penthouses, galas, and guest lists. Now her daughter's quiet empire made all that shimmer seem shallow. Why didn't you tell us? She asked softly, her voice stripped of its usual edge. Because you wouldn't have listened, I said. You would have tried to turn it into something it wasn't. Gerald taught me that the moment you feel the need to prove yourself, you've already forgotten your worth. I didn't want to forget. For a moment, silence again. The weight of my words pressed heavier than any designer necklace at the table. Blake broke it, but the sharpness was gone from his voice. Instead, he sounded small. So your company, it's real. It's not just a startup scraping by. It's real, I said simply. We employ hundreds. We've saved thousands of small businesses. And now, with government contracts, we're changing systems that have been broken for decades. His eyes dropped to his plate. For the first time, his suit looked less like armor and more like a costume. You could have told me, he whispered. I tilted my head. Would you have believed me? He didn't answer. The others, however, couldn't stay quiet. Amber leaned in eagerly. Angelica, if you're hiring, I could. No, I said flatly. Her mouth snapped shut. Madison, desperate to regain footing, tried a different angle. So you named it Klein Dynamics after Gerald. That's touching. He must have thought very highly of you. He did, I said softly, touching the watch. And I of him. The table fell into silence again. This time it wasn't mockery or disbelief that held it. It was the slow, dawning realization that the cousin they had dismissed had surpassed them all. My father finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying weight. Angelica's built something lasting, something that matters. Gerald saw it. Now the rest of you do. His eyes met mine, pride burning there, but also something else, regret, as though he wished he had said it sooner. For the first time, I allowed myself to meet his gaze fully, and in that moment, I felt it, the shift. For years, I had been seeking his recognition. Now, it was freely given. It was almost too much. As the plates were cleared and coffee poured, the questions resumed, softer now, but relentless. Madison wanted to know about IPOs. Richard suggested tax strategies. Pamela wondered about charity galas. But beneath it all, a new current ran through the room, envy. Amber whispered to Madison again, her eyes darting to my watch. Blake sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his glass empty. Richard watched me like a chess player eyeing a dangerous opponent. And my mother looked at me as though she didn't recognize her own daughter. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the silence work in my favor. Because for the first time in my life, they weren't dismissing me. They were afraid of me. The library always smelled the same leather-aged wood and the faint hint of my father's scotch. After dinner, the family gathered there as tradition demanded, tumbling into leather chairs and crystal glasses of whiskey, like characters in a play too rehearsed to ever change. But tonight the performance was off script. Conversations splintered. Normally Richard would dominate with market gossip while Blake basked in his reflected glory. Tonight Richard was quiet, swirling his drink, calculating. Blake lingered near the bar, his suit suddenly ill-fitting, his laughter forced. Pamela's voice carried as she pitched me on a gala partnership, but her eyes betrayed greed. Amber fiddled with her phone, sneaking glances at me, hungry for a connection she had once dismissed. And through it all, my father's gaze followed me, thoughtful, heavy, with things unsaid. Blake was the first to crack. He approached as I stood near the bookshelves, fingers trailing the spines of volumes. I doubted anyone had opened in years. His voice was low, stripped of its usual bravado. "I owe you an apology," he said. I turned, surprised to see no smirk on his face, only something raw. For what exactly? For years, he admitted, swallowing hard. For treating you like you were beneath me. For mocking you. For assuming. I studied him. "And would you still be apologizing if Klein Dynamics wasn't worth billions?" He winced. "That's fair." "No," I said, steady. "It's the only question that matters. If your respect depends on my balance sheet, then it isn't respect at all." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his shoulders slumped, and I saw him not as my arrogant cousin, but as a man stripped of his armor. "You're right. I don't know how to measure people without money titles things. Maybe I never learned how. But tonight, you made me see how wrong that is." It was the first time I'd heard sincerity in his voice. Gerald would have told me to recognize even the smallest crack of growth. I nodded, then start by listening. "Success isn't about what you flaunt. It's about what you build." He gave a small, humbled nod. For once, Blake had nothing more to say. My mother approached next, her steps precise, but her composure fraying at the edges. She sat beside me on the velvet sofa, her diamond bracelet catching the firelight. "Darling," she said softly, "I feel terrible. All those years I worried aloud about your choices, your apartment, your clothes, the buses. I only wanted what was best for you." "What you thought was best," I corrected gently. She flinched. "If I'd known—" "That's the problem, Mom. You would have accepted my choices only if they came with a valuation attached. But I needed you to accept them for what they were." Her eyes filled, though she blinked quickly to keep tears from spilling. "I only wanted you safe, happy." "I am happy," I said. "Not because of the money, because of the impact. Because Gerald showed me that worth isn't about what people see, but about what we create. That's what I wanted you to believe in me, not my net worth." She touched my hand, her grip tight, as though holding on to something slipping away. Perhaps I never understood, but I'll try. I squeezed her fingers. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. My father joined me later when the noise had swelled again into forced cheer. He handed me a glass of whiskey and settled into the chair beside mine. "You've given them all something to think about tonight," he said quietly. "That was never my intention," I replied. "I just wanted to be treated like a person, not a bank account. Positive or negative." He chuckled softly. "Welcome to the curse of wealth. People see the money, not the person." Gerald understood that better than anyone. I touched the watch. He told me once he could count on one hand the people who knew him, not his net worth. My father swirled his glass, thoughtful. I wish I'd known him better. We crossed paths at conferences, but I never really spoke to him. He looked at me, his eyes softening. "Now I see I should have, because I see him in you." The words caught me off guard. "You do?" He nodded. The determination, the restraint, the refusal to let others define you. Watching you tonight, I realized how much I underestimated you. Not because I doubted your intelligence, but because I thought I knew better. I was wrong. For a moment, the library faded, the chatter dimmed, and all I saw was my father, his pride, naked and real. And for the first time, I believed it. But not everyone shared his clarity. Across the room, Richard watched me. His smile polite, but his eyes sharp. He hadn't spoken since dessert, and that worried me more than his usual condescension. Richard was dangerous when quiet. He wasn't a man who accepted being outshone, especially not by his niece. I caught his gaze and held it. He raised his glass in a mock salute, the gesture both acknowledgement and warning. Gerald's watch ticked steadily on my wrist, a reminder. Patience. Precision. Discipline. I smiled faintly, matching Richard's silent challenge. This wasn't over. As the night wound down, the fractures in the family were visible in every gesture. Amber clung to Madison, whispering frantically. Pamela feigned delight at everything I said, though her eyes screamed calculation. Blake lingered near the fire, his arrogance cracked his thoughts heavy. My mother hovered close, uncertain but softening, and my father stayed near a steady presence as though unwilling to let the connection slip away again. The hierarchy had been shattered. The dinner that began with mockery had ended with revelations none of them could ignore. But I knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. Families don't change overnight. They plot, they adapt, they wait. And as Gerald once warned me, The moment you reveal your power, others will try to claim it. The night had ended in apologies, regrets, and new respect. But the war was only beginning. The library glowed with firelight and low lamplight, but the warmth was false. Beneath the hum of conversation and the clink of crystal glasses, a new chill settled over the room. The air felt heavier, as though my revelation at dinner had sucked all the oxygen out and replaced it with something sharper. Envy calculation. Uneasy admiration. My cousins, aunts, and uncles orbited me now where once I'd been invisible. Every laugh, every glance, every carefully phrased question bent in my direction, as though I were no longer just Angelica, the odd cousin with simple clothes, but an artifact newly discovered, glittering under glass. Your foundation, Pamela began seating herself too close on the leather sofa. Her smile stretched too wide. I read about it in Vogue Philanthropy. What a marvelous cause, technology for underserved communities, wasn't it? We simply must collaborate. My friends in Palm Beach would love to host a fundraiser on your behalf. I sipped my whiskey, letting her enthusiasm hang in the air before answering. The foundation is selective with partnerships. We focus on direct impact, not pageantry. Her smile faltered, then reassembled itself, though her eyes betrayed irritation. Beside her, Amber leaned in her perfume, strong enough to sting. Actually, I've been thinking about starting something too. A fashion tech startup. Influencer-driven. Maybe you could guide me, connect me with your team. No, I said softly but firmly. Amber blinked. Excuse me. Startups aren't accessories, Amber. They're not villas you buy in Capri or handbags you rotate every season. They require sacrifice. Her cheeks flushed, her lips pressing into a pout. For once, she had no quick retort. Richard circled like a shark, his whiskey glass in hand, his smile polished, but his eyes hard. Control is admirable, he said, finally sliding into the seat across from me. But imagine what you could achieve with the right partnerships. Expansion, global reach, political influence. This family has connections you could never buy. I'm not for sale, I replied evenly. Everything has a price. His voice dropped, his eyes narrowing. Even integrity. I held his gaze, my pulse steady. Then you've already lost, Uncle, because mine isn't negotiable. He studied me silent for a long moment, then raised his glass in a mock toast. We'll see. The fire cracked between us, sparks hissing. It wasn't a conversation. It was a declaration of war. Meanwhile, Blake lingered by the bookshelves, watching. Not with the calculation of his father, but with something else, unease. He finally approached, hands shoved in his pockets, posture hunched. You dismantled me tonight, he admitted quietly. I didn't, I said. Your arrogance did. He winced, but didn't argue. Still, I saw something in you I never expected. Something I envy. Not the money, but the clarity. I've been chasing status my whole life, and now I wonder if I've been chasing smoke. I tilted my head, surprised at his honesty. Smoke burns away Blake. Impact doesn't. For once, he nodded without defense. Maybe I need to learn that. His sincerity felt real, but sincerity I'd learned was fragile. I'd wait to see if it lasted. My mother hovered at the edge of the room, her drink untouched. When she finally joined me, she looked less like the flawless hostess and more like a woman unmoored. You're not who I thought you were, she whispered. I've always been who I am, I said gently. You just never looked closely. Her eyes shimmered, but she blinked the emotion away, clinging to poise. Perhaps I didn't want to. Because if you didn't need the life I built, then what did it mean for mine? For the first time, I saw her vulnerability. The Chanel dresses, the galas, the marble kitchens, all armor. Without it, she was just a woman afraid of being ordinary. I touched her hand. It means nothing unless you believe it. But I believe in what I've built. That has to be enough. She nodded, though the confusion in her eyes lingered. My father joined me near the fire, his presence steady. You handled them well, he murmured. They see dollar signs, not me. Some of them, he agreed. His gaze shifted to Richard, who was deep in conversation with Madison. But I see you, and tonight I think they did too, whether they admit it or not. His pride glowed warmer than the fire. It filled a void I hadn't realized still ached. Gerald would be proud, he added. I touched the watch, its tick steady. He is. I feel it. As the night wore on, the library emptied in clusters. Pamela excused herself with feigned exhaustion. Amber sulked upstairs. Madison pretended to scroll through. I knew she was scouring every article she could find about my company. Richard left last, pausing at the door to glance back at me, his expression unreadable. When finally the room was quiet, I sank into the armchair by the fire. the flames reflected in Gerald's watch, casting small sparks across its glass face. I realized then that while the hierarchy of the Hayes family had shifted, it hadn't disappeared. Respect won in an instant can vanish just as quickly. Tonight had cracked the facade. But cracks don't heal, they spread. And something told me the fractures had only just begun. 3 weeks after the dinner, I sat in my office overlooking Madison Avenue. The glass walls reflected not just the city skyline, but the quiet hum of my company, a space alive with engineers, analysts, designers, all working toward a vision most of my family could never understand. The night of revelations had settled into memory, but its echoes hadn't faded. They rippled outward, reshaping relationships, exposing truths, sowing both possibility and danger. My father had been the first to act. He visited my office the following week, arriving in his understated suit rather than the tuxedos that usually defined him at family events. He toured the space, shook hands with my team, asked sharp, thoughtful questions about our platform. When he left, he said something that lingered. "You've built culture here, Angelica, not just a company. That's rarer than any contract." For the first time in my life, I believed he wasn't comparing me to Richard or Blake. He was seeing me on my own terms. Our conversations became regular, not father to child, but peer to peer. And it was enough. Blake surprised me next. He called awkward at first, then asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed skeptical, but when he arrived, he didn't bring arrogance. He brought curiosity. "I've started volunteering," he confessed. "A coding program for kids. It's different. They don't care about my watch or my title. They just care if I can help them learn. And for the first time, I feel useful." I studied him, looking for the smirk, but it wasn't there. "Then maybe you're finally measuring yourself by impact," I said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe." For Blake, it wasn't redemption yet, but it was a start. My mother, Eleanor, was slower to shift. She still couldn't reconcile my choices with her worldview. Every phone call carried a subtle tug, an invitation to galas, a suggestion about apartments, hints about living in comfort. But beneath it, there was something else, now hesitation, a faint awareness that perhaps she didn't have all the answers. "Your father tells me you're expanding into Europe," she said once, her voice light, but her eyes cautious. "We are," I replied. "But I'm more excited about the Foundation's new mentorship program." Her lips pressed thin as though philanthropy were somehow less impressive than acquisitions. But she didn't argue. That silence was progress. Richard, though, remained a problem. He hadn't spoken to me directly since the dinner, but whispers reached me through cousins and colleagues alike. Questions about my company's financials. Hints dropped in investor circles. His silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. One evening, a message arrived from an anonymous source. "Richard is making calls. He wants to know your vulnerabilities." I smiled grimly. Gerald had warned me, power attracts predators. Expect the circling. I wasn't afraid, but I was ready. The Foundation gave me clarity when the family noise threatened to overwhelm. One crisp autumn afternoon, I met Zoe, a high school student whose application had stood out for its brilliance and grit. She wanted to use data analytics to map food deserts in urban neighborhoods. "You're not like the others," she told me nervously. "You don't look rich." I laughed softly. Maybe that's why I understand. Rich is just a number. Vision is something else. Her project blossomed under our mentorship. Watching her thrive reminded me why Gerald had given me this watch, why he'd believed in me. Not for dinners or debates, not for valuations or contracts, but for impact. The subway home that night was crowded, the air thick with the smell of fried food and damp coats. I sat among strangers, a nurse in scrubs, a man with paint under his nails, a student asleep on her backpack. No one knew I'd just approved a $20 million grant for education. No one cared. And that was the beauty of it. True wealth is invisible. Gerald's voice echoed as steady as the watch ticking on my wrist. Looking back, I realized that night in Connecticut hadn't changed me. It had only revealed me. The person I had always been, the builder, the quiet force, the one who valued substance over spectacle, had stepped into the light. The family saw me differently now. Some with pride, some with envy, some with greed. But none of that mattered as much as the lesson Gerald had drilled into me. The moment you need others to validate your worth, you've already lost it. I no longer needed their recognition. Still, I thought of my father, his proud eyes in the library, of Blake, kneeling awkwardly beside kids learning to code, of Eleanor finally silenced, if only by doubt, even of Richard sharpening his knives in the shadows. Legacies take many forms. My family's had been measured in marble and Maseratis, headlines, and mergers. Mine would be measured differently in students like Zoe, in businesses saved and systems changed. As I unlocked the door to my modest apartment, the watch caught the lamplight, its face glowing gold. Gerald had worn it through 3 companies, 2 crashes, 1 resurrection. Now it marked my hours, my choices, my future. The Hayes family dinner had been a battlefield. But the real war, the one for meaning, for purpose, for impact, was mine to fight. And I had already won.